So I will let Brad introduce himself, but Brad, welcome to the panel.
Hey everybody, how's it going?
Oh, also, just one note, we will save Q&A for the end just to make sure that we have time to cover all the content.
Great. Can everyone hear me okay? I've heard my voice is a little quiet. Okay, good. So a little bit about me. As Lori said, I'm the VP of Professional Services here at BrightEdge. Been with the company for about 14 months. Before that, I've sort of been across the sort of the digital landscape, testing, analytics, social, email, kind of full gamut kind of stuff. One fun fact, well, it's not really fun for me, but I'm sure hopefully you guys will get a kick out of it. I've heard that I sound like Seth Rogen, so during the course of this conversation, if all you're thinking about is Seth Rogen movies, that's completely okay. All right, so let's kick it off. So you heard Josh and Jim and Lim talk a lot about sort of the maturity curve and maturity model. So I wanted to touch on that today. And what I would say is, you know, the landscape is really changing. There are 2.7 zettabytes of data, of digital data right now, right? And 92% of it is produced by everyone here in this room, right? Social, content, and organic. And so the landscape's really changing. So what we're going to talk about a little bit today is sort of the different phases of maturity, and we'll actually end with a case study. So hopefully you guys can see this in practice. So the first stage of sort of the content maturity is sort of this emerging phase. And really what this is, you know, sort of very focused on just getting assets optimized, doing a little bit of paid search. Social's not really that prevalent in this phase. So as you're starting to get really ramped up on content, you're probably doing a little bit of sort of maybe some individual Twitter or Facebook for your PR department or maybe marketing department. You're doing a little bit of content probably digitally, but most of it's probably focused on offline, right? So as we start to think about this, we'll go a little bit to the next phase. When you move up the curve from a foundational perspective, what you're talking about here is now where you're starting to get much more into sort of the search landscape, more technically driven, a bit more algorithmically driven as well. You're doing a little bit of paid search synergy, a very little bit, but you're really using organic as sort of a benchmark. On the social front, really what you're doing here is you're doing a little bit of sort of maybe business account setup. You're doing a little bit of experimentation, but it's really basic content. The thing that I would focus on as you're sort of moving up the curve, and it sounds a little bit obvious, is really understanding your customers' needs. And it sounds basic, but oftentimes I'm in client meetings and I hear, you know what I really want the customer to do? This, whether it's make an appointment or find this content. And the thing that's super critical is customers will be loyal to you if you're loyal to them. And so giving them that content at the right place, at the right time, in that moment when it matters is really critical. So as you start to move up the phase to scaling, this is where it starts to get super interesting. And we're talking to clients today where, you know, in this phase, it's a little bit of organic and paid synergy. You're starting to reduce some refinement and testing, but organic is starting to take the lead. So Jim touched on this a little bit in his keynote. The thing that I would say is we're having access to organic and BrightEdge platform. The way I typically like to think about it is we have access to the largest focus group on the planet. And what you get to do is see how people's interests and perceptions change week over week and month over month. And when you think about it that way, what becomes super critical is because of that 2.7 zettabytes of data that's happening, what we're also seeing is that oftentimes where there's silos across teams, right? So you have different KPIs that you're measured against, you have different processes that you're measured against, you have all these different things. So I'll throw a little bit of an anecdote out there. So there was an e-consultancy study that was done about a year ago at this point. On average, 30% of companies right now use more than 30 MarTech vendors today at one time, 30 different ones. So if you can imagine as you're starting to scale, right, at this level, what's happening is you got a lot of folks, I'm in these client interactions and they're speaking about the same thing without knowing it because everyone's using different vernacular, using different metrics, using different technology. So the thing that I would say at the scaling phase is super critical is aligning on technology. So that way you have the same foundation of what you're talking about. So everyone uses slightly different terms, different processes, and that's where you can start to build out the org structure as you start to scale. So with this, again, you're doing a little bit of synergy, you're doing a little bit of testing. Social's starting to amplify, right, the messaging that you're trying to create across the landscape. And you're starting to use some listening and monitoring as well. And then you're starting also to sort of optimize that content at the point of creation. So you heard Jim and Lem talk a lot about IX. It really becomes the benchmark of success as you start to create this content. And what I would say is, at this phase, it's super critical. I'm going to come back to the point I just made, which is aligning on technology. Because oftentimes I'm sitting in client meetings and what's happening is everyone's creating all this content, right? And everyone wants to do better governance, everyone wants to do better change management. And what ends up happening is your branding either gets a little bit muddied and the messaging isn't consistent. And I'll actually walk through a case study of someone that's doing this really well, where they're capitalizing on that opportunity. At the high performing phase, this is where you start to get really into leveraging all this data to create a consistent message across various channels. So here, organic is really positioned at the center of all online marketing. And what I would say is, full disclosure, before I was at BrightEdge, I was actually at a couple of other different marketing technology companies. And I often used BrightEdge data to do things like testing, to do things like email, to do things like cross-channel, omni-channel type stuff, because it's such a rich data set that as you start to move up that curve, it's really, really critical to sort of permeate that messaging in an omni-channel fashion. So what we're seeing here is that from a social perspective, we're really starting to inform search and content strategies. You're embedding it in things like PR and customer service. I'll share a little bit of an anecdote on this slide where I was literally just at a client meeting and we were talking about ways that we could actually leverage all the search data that's coming in to actually give back to the call centers so that they can proactively understand what the challenges are that your customers are facing and address them proactively based on what's happening, and doing a little bit of competitive handling as necessary, a little bit of objection handling as necessary, really understanding that. And then from a content perspective, you're mapping to the customer journey. So understanding not only those micro moments, but where are they? Are they looking for more browsing? Are they looking ready to buy? What is that? And you're doing a little bit more attribution and measurement, right, at this phase of the game. So at the innovative level, this is where you're very highly performant. You're using this search activity to really drive product and innovation. You're using it for sales strategies. So again, you can sort of see through the BrightEdge platform, what are your competitors doing versus what are you doing? What's the perception versus the reality? Push that out into the market. So you're creating that consistent message that's really permeating and anchoring on your differentiators, right? Social, you're driving meaningful interactions with your customers, whether it's you're using Twitter to sort of do customer support. I was recently at a hotel and within 5 minutes of my checking in, I'd already gotten a tweet that said, hey, hope you're enjoying this day. Check out the free breakfast kind of thing. So doing everything in real time. And then content, it's hyper personalized. The thing is, and you heard Jim and Lim talking about this, everyone, you can understand sort of in masses what's happening, but getting really hyper personalized across your content and across channels really enables you to amplify that branding, that messaging, that differentiation. And the thing is more and more, you're seeing really disruption happen in the market, whether it's in retail where you're starting to see people optimize the supply chain. I mean, Amazon just bought airplanes, right? Whether it's in the asset management where they're passing legislation that says, you know what, people are starting to change their profile of investing, and now you're starting to see different structures come into place for investing in 401ks. Or whether it's in hospitality, and you're seeing different nuances come into play around attractions and local and things like that. So in this innovative phase, it really is super critical because there's more content than ever before, that you stay on message, that it's consistent, because you don't want to confuse your customers. At the heart of everything we're talking about is how do you communicate to your customers effectively to understand what you bring to the table as a company, right? So I'll talk a little bit about a case study and then I'll walk through an example of how this is actually working. So last year, the CMO of Wiley came in and shared how they're doing this digital maturity. And he, for context, they're the publisher. So if you've ever seen the Dummies books, that's Wiley. They're a 208-year-old sort of traditional publisher. And they're recognizing the need to really be more digital in the face of other publishing disruption. I mean, you can now publish a book by yourself on Amazon right now, right? It's just, the landscape is really rapidly changing. And so what he was talking about was really shifting mindset more toward digital. You're getting an executive commitment to really do continuous digital performance. So they were using not only the BrightEdge data, but again, standardizing on technology. So they standardized on testing, standardized on analytics, standardized, excuse me, on a CMS, because they have multiple brands, right? So you get that from a top down, you shift it in skill sets. So you're tiering it towards search and social and content, and you're putting in training and certifications and all those kinds of things. And lastly, they're focusing on marketing as a revenue driver. And so that last bullet there was one of the most impressive things I've heard, where digital products and services now represent 60% of its $1.82 billion in revenue. It's a traditional publisher, right? They sell books. So it's really, really critical, even in publishing, how the landscape is evolving that quickly. So we've talked a little bit at a high level, sort of around the different phases and how you can think about that as you mature. I wanted to highlight sort of an example that we were working on with a client recently. I've purposely masked it just so that way there's no confusion. So what we did is, so there are two banks, they're online banks only, right? And one of the challenges that we're seeing is as more things move to online, the human interaction is going away, right? And so if you think about going into a branch, asking questions about deposits, asking questions about 401ks or whatever it may be, you had that trusted advisor. Well, that's going away because people are trying to optimize their spend, optimize their margin, trying to proliferate their message. And so in this instance, we're looking at two online banks. And you can see here from the screenshot, Bank A has 40 times the presence and content footprint than Bank B, right? So you can see that there, the purple line and the blue line. And what you can see is there's also on page one, there's 20 times greater visibility, right? So the first thing that you're seeing is one bank is really executing on their branding, on their messaging, getting their content out there, right? Well, that's great, but what are they doing? How are they doing it? What are they trying to communicate? So you don't necessarily think of banks as blogging, right? You don't think about pushing a lot of content as a bank. Well, in this instance, this bank is doing tremendously well from a blog perspective. What they're doing is they're investing quite significantly, where you can see that year to date in this slide, 150% growth in content just on their blog, right? Now you think, okay, what does a blog contain, right? Assets, checking accounts, money markets, whatever it may be. Well, no, that's not what they're trying to do, right? What you're seeing is they're growing their footprint with very, very specific messaging, and they're backing it up because they don't have the branch, right? So what you're seeing here is their Bank A is trying to really brand themselves as straight talk, right? I can give you what you need, when you need it, very, very simply. So I'm going to call out the bottom screenshot at first. What you can see is the second one from the bottom, from the top, straight talk, has 1,500,000 searches a month. This bank is ranking, let's call it between page 2 and page 3. That's crazy. Think about the messaging that's getting amplified there. Not only are they doing that and trying to amplify that brand, they're backing it up with the way they're creating content. So what you're seeing here on the top left is all the words for their help section, right? So they're trying to answer all these questions within their help section because they don't have a branch. They recognize that. So they're trying to not only to communicate the brand value, but they're also trying to communicate and actively monitor and manage how you find things rather than having to call customer support, right? Because how often do you want to get that dial tone of please press 1, please press 2. So they're doing this by really growing their deposits to try and humanize their brand, right? I can't stress that enough. We have more content than ever before, but we're becoming less human, right? You want to feel as though that brand, that content is speaking to you. It's really critical that you do it across the landscape. And in this instance, the thing that is really, really powerful is they were saving about $500,000 a year in call center costs. You could reinvest that back into the business to try and grow deposits, to try and grow your bottom line, right? Well, that's great. But here's the crazy thing. So remember I said that Bank B had like 40 times the presence of Bank A? Well, Bank A was also not only messaging the straight talk, the human sort of notion, and the helps and the beefing up their help section. What they're also doing is saying, not only do we have great service through online, we have the best rates, right? That's what they're talking about. But here's the crazy thing: they don't. Bank B that doesn't have the footprint has a better rate than Bank A, right? So they're missing the opportunity. There's a tremendous opportunity here, right? And so this is how you can really start to take action on that maturity and say, hey, you know what? We can all come together, create one message, and really amplify your brand and grow your bottom line. Okay? So what are some key takeaways? One, it sounds so simple, but I can't tell you the number of meetings I sit in where I have people coming to me and saying, I really want people to do X. Well, that's great, but you have to understand why your customers would want to do that. Don't push them, right? And I'll use the example of my wife. Unfortunately, I try and watch football every Sunday. My wife says, no dice, not going to happen, right? But the more people that you're bringing in, just because I tell them that I want to do it, doesn't mean it's going to happen. You have to understand the customer need, first and foremost. And you have BrightEdge, again, you have access to the largest focus group on the planet. Second, you have to align and evangelize your competitive advantages. Things are starting to heat up, right? You can't just compete on price. You have to make sure and evangelize why you are different as you start to proliferate this content out. You have to do it. Because if your message gets muddied, again, so one point I'll throw out there are 400 million Facebook posts every minute. Every minute, right? You're just getting inundated with content. You have to make sure that at every point you're saying the same thing. You're differentiating. You're talking about why you're different, why you're better, why choose you, either for loyalty or for acquisition. It has to happen. Third, holistically look at content and messaging you push into the market. As Jim said, in his presentation, I think something like 70% of content never gets seen. Well, you're spending a lot of time. You guys are coming to this conference. You're spending a lot of money and time on these different vendors. Again, there's 30 vendors on average that everyone in this room is using for marketing technology. You have the most immense amount of data at your disposal to understand your customers, but it's also becoming harder if you're trying to mix and match different technologies. Third, standardize. You have to make sure you're speaking the same language. If you're not, everything is going to get muddied. Last, evolve, iterate, test, and personalize. The landscape is changing. What your customers want, what they need, what they expect is evolving really, really rapidly, right? And every time you push a piece of content, specifically from an organic perspective, it's going to stay out there. You need to make sure that you're able to communicate very, very effectively what's happening. Okay? With that, I'll turn it back over to Lori. Appreciate your time, guys. Seth Rogen, watch a movie.